Hi, everybody. Wanted to post this video about the Vietnam War, which will be one of our big topics during our discussion of the Cold War this week and into next week. This will all be on the test that we take next Wednesday or Thursday, depending on what corps you're in. And we'll be doing some activities around all of this information in class starting on Wednesday. So hopefully you take some good notes. You come in with good questions because there's a lot of things on here that you might have questions about. The Vietnam War is obviously part of the Cold War. The dates for the Vietnam War are quite complicated and controversial. I put on here 1954 to 1975. That would make it a 21-year war. Most Americans don't use those dates. They date it sometimes more, maybe like 1964. 54 is the date that the first American puts feet on the ground in Vietnam, and 1975 is the last day that Americans leave. That's why I use that 21-year span, because we're going to look at the whole history of the event, not just the time where like the big amounts of fighting go on, but just want to give you an upfront information that maybe these dates aren't quite, you'll see different dates in different places, and don't be concerned about that. Okay. Just to review some things that we've talked about before, we know that containment is our policy during the Cold War. The Vietnam War doesn't make any sense unless you understand containment, that we're fighting this war to stop the spread of communism. And also, to go along with containment is the idea of domino theory. If you've ever, maybe when you were little, you played with dominoes, you stacked a whole line of dominoes up one next to the other, and then you push one and then they all fall down. We thought in many ways that's how communism would work in Asia. That if you allowed one country in Asia to become communist, then that would put pressure on all of its neighboring countries to also become communist. Thus, the idea that we have to stop the spread of communism, particularly in Asia, so that we don't allow communism to spread like falling dominoes. The country called Vietnam today used to be called French Indochina. Believe it or not, Vietnam was a French colony, really from the 1800s all the way up to World War II. And if you go to Vietnam today, people still speak French. You'll see buildings in a French style. There's a lot of French influence because of the long time that this was a colony. During World War II, Vietnam, French Indochina, whatever you want to call it, is captured by the Japanese. And during World War II, obviously the French are fighting against the Japanese, trying to get their colony back, but the Vietnamese people also fought back. And a man was particularly involved in that by the name of Ho Chi Minh. That picture there is a picture of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh fought against the Japanese, and then after World War II, pushed to make Vietnam an independent country. He wanted to make it independent, not just from Japanese colonialism, but also French colonialism. When World War II ends, the French come back and say, hey, we're back and we own you again. And this causes significant problems because Ho Chi Minh really wants to be and lead the Vietnamese people and be independent. So a war breaks out after World War II between the Vietnamese people, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the French. It goes on for a number of years. And finally, in 1954, the Vietnamese, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, defeat the French at a place called Dien Bien Phu. And it's at that point that the French decide, look, we're leaving, we're going to get out of here and let Vietnam become an independent country. None of this seems to be particularly important to American history, except that Ho Chi Minh was a little bit communist. Now, exactly what amount of communism he believed in, it's hard to say. He was getting some of his support from China, who wanted to get the French out of Vietnam so that it wouldn't have any European powers in their neighborhood. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not Ho Chi Minh was a communist before he goes to war with America, before the French are kicked out. Maybe he was just a revolutionary leader who wanted independence for his country. But America is going to start paying attention when Ho Chi Minh is about to take over Vietnam because we're concerned about the spread of communism. If you look on this map, okay, you can see the photo on the left is sort of the aftermath of the Dien Bien Phu, a major battle, really big fighting that took place. On the right, you see a map of Vietnam. On the insert, you can see where Vietnam is. This country is just south of China. It makes up most of the east coast of Southeast Asia. You can see where Dien Bien Phu is. It's a major military base up in the mountains in the northern part of Vietnam. If you look at Vietnam, this is a country with a huge coastline, a country where fishing is very important, and growing rice is very important as part of the culture. There's a lot of junglist territory in Vietnam, and all those things are going to be really important as we get into talking about the war when the United States arrives. We were very afraid after the French leave and Ho Chi Minh takes over that the country would become 100% communist. So the country was divided temporarily, quote unquote, into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, and South Vietnam under the leadership of a Vietnamese person, but a Vietnamese person who was really closely allied with the United States. And the idea was that we would have elections at some point in the near future, like in the mid to late 1950s, to unite the country under one leader. But those elections never happened, because it was very clear that Ho Chi Minh would have won any elections that happened. If you think about, what Ho Chi Minh's role is, in many ways he's the George Washington of Vietnam, right? He fights a war against a colonial power to help the country get its independence, very much like George Washington does for the United States against Great Britain. And because of that, he has massive popularity. The fact that he's sort of communist doesn't matter to most Vietnamese people. And thus, the United States, through its ally in South Vietnam, blocks any elections and prevents the country from reuniting. And this is when the war begins, as North Vietnam fights South Vietnam to reunite the country under one government, in this case under the government of Ho Chi Minh. The United States had sent troops to Vietnam before 1964, mostly to act in a training capacity, so they were training South Vietnamese soldiers how to fight. And there is some small-scale fighting that takes place before 1964. But the big moment of escalation comes with an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin, which we'll be talking about in class. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water just to the east of Vietnam. And in 1964, an American ship, much like the one you see pictured there on the left, is attacked by the North Vietnamese Navy. Okay, the North Vietnamese Navy were two fishing boats, essentially, with some guns on them. These ships never posed any serious threat to the American ship. And above and beyond that, there's some question today as to whether or not this incident ever even took place, whether we just was completely made up. But in any event, as we've seen in previous wars, when an American ship is supposedly attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, even though it was a minor attack, not really threatening our ship, this becomes the reason that we escalate the war. And when our ship is attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, at this Gulf of Tonkin incident, President Lyndon Baines Johnson goes to Congress and says, you need to give me more money, more supplies, more troops, because we are, we've been attacked. So throughout the 1960s, 65, 66, 67, 68, more and more troops from the United States are being sent to Vietnam, and more bombs are being dropped on North Vietnam, as the war escalates throughout that time period. Eventually, by the late 1960s, we'll be in the situation where there's a draft, so men are being forced to go fight in Vietnam. Also that we can keep South Vietnam separate from North Vietnam and free of communism. This war, in terms of fighting and military techniques, was not a war that America could lose. We had more troops, more highly trained troops than the North Vietnamese, and we had better weapons and better strategies. So when we met on a battlefield, we would win most of the battles. The problem was that the North Vietnamese wanted to use a guerrilla style of warfare and not fight us on battles. People from North Vietnam and South Vietnam do not look different. So it was easy for North Vietnamese soldiers to dress like civilians, sneak in and launch attacks on American soldiers, blowing up their barracks, killing them when they were in bars in cities, not necessarily fighting on a battlefield. This use of these surprise attacks makes it very hard for the United States to win. In 1968, the North Vietnamese launch a series of surprise attacks called the Tet Offensive. These attacks killed a lot of American soldiers and a lot of South Vietnamese. They were relatively unsuccessful in accomplishing anything militarily. It's not like they gained a whole bunch of territory from South Vietnam. But what's different about this fighting is that by 1968, Americans have televisions. And now, for the first time in the history of the country, Americans can see video from Vietnam of dead bodies, of American soldiers being blown up in these, random places in the cities of South Vietnam. And although the U.S. is able to defeat the North Vietnamese militarily, the images that Americans are seeing back in the United States are destroying the will to keep fighting politically. And that's really the most important point about South Vietnam and about the Vietnam War, is that America could have continued fighting indefinitely in Vietnam. We had the money, we had the resources, but the American public is deciding, after seeing things on their TV screens after 1968, that this war isn't worth fighting. They don't understand why we're fighting it. They don't get containment policy. They think it's a waste of money and resources and lives. And many people begin to question, what is this about and why is it going on? There are massive student protests that are launched in the late 1960s against the Vietnam War. You see lots of students who are drafted refusing to go, many running to Canada to get away from the draft, and just young people generally speaking out about how they don't understand what this war is about and that we shouldn't be fighting it. Popular music, as we'll be studying in class, very closely reflects the mood in the United States among these young people, and you get massive, popular music is speaking out completely against the Vietnam War, almost completely against the Vietnam War. And you get famous events like the Woodstock Music Festival in 1968, where a whole bunch of famous bands get together and they play, they're protesting for peace against the Vietnam War and playing all these songs. Lyndon Johnson, pictured there on the right, who was so popular when he became president after Kennedy was assassinated, he doesn't even bother running for re-election in 1968. He knows he would lose because the war has become so unpopular and he's become the face of it that it's unlikely he could win if he decides to run for re-election, so he just decides to retire. You can see some pictures of the quote-unquote hippies and the other protesters who were involved. The poster on the left is a poster for the Woodstock Music Festival, which is a really famous moment from this. We'll be spending some time in class talking about the Kent State shootings. Some of these protests took place at Kent State, which is a major university just outside of Cleveland. In 1970 at Kent State, 4 students were shot and killed when the National Guard opened fire on a group of student protesters. They claim by accident. This becomes a really big rallying cry, even more for the anti-Vietnam movement. And it's this change in public opinion and all of these protests that divide the country and eventually get us out of the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon becomes president in 1968 when Lyndon Johnson retires. He wins again in 1972. He goes through what he calls the Vietnamization of the war. He promises when he's running for president that we will leave Vietnam, we will win and we will leave. But the war continues to escalate as he's president. He secretly expands the war to Cambodia and Laos and has the United States drop bombs in these other countries trying to stop the Vietnamese from using them as a place to attack Americans from. This is illegal, but he did it. And it causes a whole bunch of turmoil and tension. Eventually, Nixon will resign for a different problem he had, getting some of his advisors to break into Democratic headquarters and steal information before the 1972 election. But Nixon is as much swept up in this war as Lyndon Johnson is, and it drags on well into the 1970s, long after most Americans wanted it to conclude. You can see here on this map Laos and Cambodia. The U.S. was bombing into those countries. They're mostly jungleless, right? So it's hard to tell when you're in one country or the other. the Vietnamese were sneaking, North Vietnamese were sneaking through Laos and Cambodia and using them as staging grounds to attack into South Vietnam. It was illegal to bomb those countries, but that's what we did in an attempt to stop the enemy that we were fighting against. And it widens the war and causes massive problems in both countries. Eventually, Cambodia is going to, have its government break down, and there'll be a large genocide there as a result of all the turmoil in the region in the 1970s. The war officially ends in 1975. When finally the United States makes the decision that we are withdrawing. This is a famous photo of the last helicopter out of Vietnam. So it's leaving from the roof of the American embassy, taking key officials. But there were many, many, many people in South Vietnam who'd been working with the United States. You had many women who had children with American soldiers, so their children were partially American. There's a lot of turmoil when America leaves, because now the country is going to be reunited and become one communist country. This is a war that the United States does not win. One of the first wars in American history that the United States does not win. And, the cost of this war is pretty staggering. More than 50,000 U.S. soldiers will die. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese will die, from both the North and the South. When the war ends, 700,000 Vietnamese people flee the United States, or flee South Vietnam. Many of them come to the United States, and there are substantial Vietnamese populations in many cities, but especially on the West Coast in America, that came after the Vietnam War. There are still a lot of legacies of Vietnam, but particularly the fear among a lot of Americans that we don't want to get into long, bogged down wars because we don't want to have to live through the turmoil that took place in the 1970s. In class later this week, we'll be looking at some specific events in the Vietnam War and talking about them. But please come to class with your questions, and I look forward to talking to you more about this over the next several days.